Ooh, we got Supreme Court news, how they can affect all of the Trump trial cases. So this is dragging everyone in. It also drags in Jack Smith. This is a strange tie between all of them because of the way they go. Thank you guys for watching. I'm Doug. This is Doug in Exile. Yeah, I wish there was a way I could say thank you for you guys watching and paying all of my bills this year, including putting my kids in college. So thank you all. So all here we go. Supreme Court weighs hearing on January 6th cases that could affect the Trump prosecution. There's going to be a lot of reading, okay, with apologies. I'll explain it as we go. And remember, I'm a barely literate comic book artist. So if I can figure it out, I'm here to interpret for you. Washington, the Supreme Court on Friday is set to consider for the first time whether to hear appeals brought by people charged with offenses related to January 6th assault on the U.S. Capitol, allegedly, in cases that could have a major impact on the criminal prosecution of President Donald Trump. Oh, I forgot to say this article is from NBC News. So I always like getting it from a more biased source because then I know that they're not exaggerating in my favor. Okay. The justices in their regular private meeting to discuss which new cases to take up are scheduled to consider three different appeals brought by defendants Joe Fisher, Edward Lang. These are three of the J6 guys. The three men are asking to dismiss a charge accusing them of obstructing an official proceeding, namely the certification by Congress of President Joe Biden's election and victory, which was disrupted by a mob of Trump supporters, probably by coincidence. So now the Supreme Court's going to vote among themselves on if they're going to take up this case. Just to give you some background on the Supreme Court, the 9 justices in general, they don't like weighing in on stuff that affects the other 2 branches of government. They don't like being seen as overreach or overstepping the separation of powers. Really huge, especially with the conservative justices. Trump has been charged with the same offense as well as others in his federal election interference case. As a result, whether the court takes up the appeals or rejects them could affect his case. Here's how it works. Okay. If the court rejects the appeals, a lower court ruling that allowed the government to pursue the charges against the defendants would remain in place. So that's bad for Trump. Because the lower courts tend to be more politicized. And that's why they ended up going to a higher court. These 3 kids did for January 6th are going to a higher court because the lower one is politicized. Okay. So if the Supreme Court says we voted, we're not going to take up this case, just it can stay at whatever the lower court decides, we're fine with. But if they take it up, that's different. Okay. But if the justices take up the cases, it would lead to a months-long delay while they hear oral arguments and issue a ruling sometime during the court's current 9-month term, which ends in June. At least 4 votes are needed for the 9 justices to hear the court case. So if they take up the case, then Trump can say in this Georgia case and his January 6th one up in DC under Jack Smith and Chutkan, he can say, look, this is still being argued in the Supreme Court, whether if I even interrupted some form of government. Okay, it's still being, and so if it's being argued at the Supreme Court, they can't go forward. That creates a delay. That's good for Trump if he waits until after the election. Remember, that's a win for him. He wants a delay. Trump's lawyers could use the Supreme Court's involvement as one opportunity to delay his election interference trial, which is scheduled to start in March of 2024. So that would Jack Smith, hopefully, and they could just drag their feet through it. If any case involved Trump, they would fast track it. It would go in probably right away at the beginning of the queue to prevent these kinds of delays. Like I said, the Supreme Court does not want to affect elections. Should the court hear the case, Trump, quote, could credibly ask to delay his trial until the case is resolved, said former federal prosecutor Randall Eleazar, who teaches at George Washington University. Trump is the front runner in the polls for the Republican presidential nomination, and any delay in his criminal trial in Washington would be to his benefit. If Trump were to win the election in November, which he will, he would then be in position to have the charges dismissed. That's what I believe the tactic is for his delay. And also why Fannie Willis and Chutkin and Jack Smith want to push all these things up and go as fast as possible. They're going like, hey, we can get juries going in like 10 hours. If the case proceeds as scheduled in March and Trump were to be convicted, he could be sentenced before the election. That is not likely. Court cases go slow. And I know that the Supreme Court would want to fast track this one, but it would be bad for Trump if they sent this to the Supreme Court and they indeed found that he obstructed through his words, that he obstructed an official proceeding of the government, which he did not do. But I'm saying they're going to treat him as if he was in the room actively taking, a podium, during and cause the whole thing to be shut down. If they find him not guilty, okay, and the other three defendants, if they say you did not obstruct a court procedure, a government procedure, if you did not, then he could go back to all of the other court cases, Jack Smith and Fannie Willis, and say, look, the Supreme Court says I was not involved to a point that it caused a governmental disruption. So how can it be interrupt enough to cause an insurrection? I think he wins. I think he looks really strong in this. This is a huge benefit to him. Thank God we have a court of conservatives and not the three leftists, the three witches. I'm Doug in Exile.